Snow was falling steadily that cold morning in rural North Dakota. The world seemed asleep under the weight of winter, and the train tracks stretched like two black veins across a sea of white. Inside the locomotive, engineer Frank Delaney kept his eyes on the foggy horizon, guiding the train with the steady hands of a man who had done this for over 4 decades. His face bore deep lines and a faraway stare, a reflection of a life shaped by solitude, especially after losing his wife Claire, and more recently, his dog Orson, who had vanished months ago without a trace. Frank had grown used to the silence of these journeys. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails was his only companion, along with the persistent memory of simpler days. But that morning, something snapped him out of the routine. A dark shape appeared ahead, lying across the tracks. He squinted through the frost-covered windshield, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. As the train drew closer, the shape became clearer. It was a dog, lying still, motionless, and as the headlights lit its body, Frank's heart dropped. Orson. The name struck his mind like a blow. Even from a distance, Frank recognized the familiar outline of the dog's head, the dark saddle of fur along his back, the way he lay so still, as if he had given up. His front legs were tied together with thick rope, and his body was partially buried in snow. Frank reacted on instinct. He yanked the emergency brake with all his strength, panic bubbling to the surface. The train shrieked in protest, sparks flying from the frozen rails. But he knew it was too close. The engine screeched to a halt just feet from the animal. Frank jumped down, slipping on the steps, heart pounding in his chest. When he reached Orson, he saw the dog's eyes move weak, but alive. Orson didn't bark, didn't flinch. He simply stared back with a quiet, exhausted gaze, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The rope around his legs was tight and cruel. Frank dropped to his knees in the snow, fumbling with frozen fingers to untie the knots, tears running down his face. As he freed Orson, the old engineer felt more than fear or sadness. He felt anger. Someone had left his best friend there to die. This was no accident. And right there, kneeling between the rails with Orson's body pressed against his chest, Frank knew this reunion was just the beginning. Whatever had happened to his dog, someone would have to answer for it. Frank didn't waste a second. With Orson wrapped tightly in an old flannel blanket he kept in the cab, he climbed back into the locomotive, arms trembling from cold and emotion. He radioed dispatch and reported a mechanical issue to justify the delay. There was no way he could explain this yet, not without sounding crazy. The dog he thought was long gone, maybe even dead, had been found tied to the rails like bait, and someone somewhere had put him there. The train rolled in reverse for several miles until it reached the nearest siding. Frank parked it, turned off the engine, and carried Orson to his truck without saying a word. He drove fast but carefully, glancing at Orson in the passenger seat every few seconds. The dog was weak, barely able to lift his head, but his eyes stayed locked on Frank as if afraid to be left again. The local vet's office, a small brick building with a faded green awning, sat at the edge of town. The bell above the door jingled as Frank entered, cradling Orson in his arms. Dr. Lauren Fielding, the town's only veterinarian, looked up from her desk and froze. "Is that Orson?" she asked, stepping closer. Her voice cracked with disbelief. Frank nodded, his throat tight. "He's alive, but he's not okay." Dr. Fielding ushered them into the back room immediately, giving orders to her assistant while Frank stayed close, refusing to let go of the dog's paw. She worked in silence at first, checking vitals, inspecting wounds, shaving fur to clean and dress the injuries. Finally, she pulled off her gloves and looked at Frank with a mix of concern and suspicion. "These rope burns. They're deliberate. Someone tied him tight. And look here," she said, pointing at a small puncture near Orson's shoulder. "This might be from a tranquilizer dart. I've seen it before in rescue cases." Frank felt the ground shift under him. A tranquilizer? He thought Orson had just wandered off and gotten lost in the snow months ago. But now this opened up something darker. "Are you saying someone took him? Held him all this time? And then left him on the tracks. His voice broke as he said the last words. Dr. Fielding didn't answer right away. She simply nodded gently. I don't think this was random, Frank. Outside, the wind howled through the parking lot like a warning. Frank stared out the window, jaw clenched, rage building beneath the surface. Someone had done this on purpose. And if Orson was a message, then it was just the beginning. The waiting room was quiet as Frank sat beside the exam door, hands clasped tightly in his lap. Dr. Fielding was inside, still monitoring Orson after giving him fluids and pain medication. Snow kept falling outside, blanketing the town in white silence. The kind of silence that didn't feel peaceful. It felt like something was holding its breath. Frank's mind wouldn't stop spinning. Why now? Why return Orson this way? And who would even know where to leave him so that Frank would be the one to find him? Dr. Fielding returned, her face calm but serious. He'll be okay, but he needs rest, food, and time. Whatever he went through, it wasn't short-term. He's been starved, kept in confinement, possibly drugged more than once. She hesitated, then added, Frank, this wasn't just someone being cruel. It was methodical. Frank looked up at her, the lines in his face seeming to deepen with each word. Do you think it's someone local? He asked, barely above a whisper. Dr. Fielding nodded slowly. It has to be. Whoever did this knew the train schedule, knew your route, and knew enough about Orson to make it personal. She handed him a clear evidence bag with a scrap of frayed rope inside. This was tied to his front legs. Maybe someone can trace it. It's not something I've seen sold locally. Frank took the bag in silence, his fingers trembling slightly as they gripped the plastic. He stood up, his posture straighter now, something shifting behind his eyes. He wasn't just a grieving old man anymore. He was a man who had been crossed. I want to find out who did this, he said, voice low and controlled. And I don't care how long it takes. He left the clinic and stepped into the cold afternoon, snow now swirling in gusts around his boots. As he approached his truck, he noticed a faint line of footprints in the snow beside his driver's door. Not his own. They led away toward the alley behind the clinic, disappearing into the wind. Frank stared at them for a long moment, unease crawling up his spine. Someone had been watching, and maybe they still were. Inside the truck, Orson lay curled in the blanket, eyes half closed, breathing shallow but steady. Frank glanced down at him, then at the rearview mirror. Whoever had done this had made one mistake. They'd left Orson alive. And now Frank wasn't just a man with questions. He was a man with nothing left to lose. The next morning, the snow had stopped, but the cold remained, sharp and dry, like it wanted to cut through every layer of skin. Frank hadn't slept. He'd stayed on the couch next to Orson all night, listening to his breathing, watching his chest rise and fall like it might stop at any moment. But Orson had held on. And now Frank had a direction. He needed answers. And there was only one person in town who knew enough about the train schedules, the equipment, and the kind of rope used near the yards. Earl Whitman, the retired yard supervisor. Earl lived in a trailer parked beside the old freight depot, a relic of the rail's glory days. Frank knocked twice, his knuckles stinging from the cold. After a moment, the door creaked open and Earl appeared, wrapped in a worn-out flannel robe, coffee in hand. He squinted at Frank like he was looking at a ghost. Well, I'll be damned. Frank Delaney. Haven't seen you in years. I need to ask you something, Frank said, skipping the pleasantries. About rope. The kind used to bind cargo back in the day. Thick, industrial, cheap. He pulled the plastic bag from his coat and held it out. Earl's eyes narrowed as he took the bag and inspected it. Humph. Haven't seen this stuff in a while. Not sold around here anymore. But Mercer Freight still uses something real close. For scrap runs. I trained half the guys who work there. They're not careful with inventory. Could have gone missing easy. He handed the bag back and stepped aside. You think this has to do with Orson? Frank stiffened. You knew. Whole damn town knew when he disappeared. Frank, you posted flyers on every pole for 3 weeks. And the way you looked after Claire passed. Hell, that dog was the only thing keeping you going. Earl paused. If someone hurt him, you let me know. Frank gave a tight nod but didn't answer. He turned to leave, but Earl called out, "Ask around about Cal Mercer, Frank. He's been off lately, working odd hours. Keeps disappearing on shift. And he don't like dogs." The name stuck. Cal Mercer. Someone Frank barely remembered, but now couldn't forget. As he walked back to his truck, the wind picked up again, and for the first time, Frank didn't feel its cold. Something else had started to burn inside him. Something hot, focused, and quiet. A resolve. If Cal had anything to do with this, Frank would find out. And he wouldn't be asking nicely next time. Frank didn't wait. He drove straight to the Mercer Freight Yard on the outskirts of town. A cluster of metal buildings, chain-link fences, and rusted equipment layered with snow and time. It was nearly empty, except for a few forklifts and one pickup truck parked near the loading bay. The name painted on the door, C. Mercer. Frank pulled in slowly, heart pounding, the rope evidence bag sitting on the passenger seat like a ticking clock. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with diesel fumes and the faint smell of burnt rubber. Frank spotted Cal Mercer near the far end, checking a clipboard and barking orders at a younger worker. Cal was in his early 40s, tall, heavyset, with a face carved by sun and cigarette smoke. He turned when he heard footsteps, eyes narrowing at the sight of Frank. "Well, if it ain't the ghost of Christmas past," Cal muttered, wiping his hands on a rag. "What brings you out here, old man?" "I've got questions," Frank said flatly. "And you're going to answer them." Cal scoffed. "You got a badge now, Frank?" Frank stepped closer and held up the evidence bag. "Recognize this? It was tied around my dog's legs. He was left on the tracks yesterday. Tied up, starving, almost dead. You know anything about that?" Cal's smirk faltered, but only for a moment. "I see rope every damn day, Frank. Doesn't mean I tied up your mutt." His tone turned defensive. "Maybe he wandered off again. You sure it wasn't just bad luck?" "Funny thing," Frank said quietly, "he vanished 3 months ago. But he shows up tied to the rails the same week you start pulling overnight shifts. Same rope you use here? Doesn't feel like luck to me." His voice cracked slightly. "Feels like someone who wanted to send a message." There was a pause. Cal's jaw tightened. "You need to leave," he said, stepping forward. "You come back here throwing accusations. I'll call the sheriff myself." Frank didn't move. He stared Cal down for several long seconds before finally turning away. But as he walked out, he felt something shift. Not in the air, but in Cal. A flicker of guilt, or maybe fear. It wasn't proof, but it was something. And sometimes, in a small town, that was all a man needed to start digging deeper. Frank drove straight to the sheriff's office. The cold morning sun had broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across Main Street. But it did nothing to ease the fire burning in his chest. Orson was stable at home, wrapped in blankets, still too weak to stand. But Frank couldn't sit still. His gut told him something about Cal Mercer didn't add up. Not just the rope or the schedule, but the way he looked at Frank when confronted. It was fear or guilt, or both. Sheriff Geneva Pruitt was behind her desk, glasses low on her nose, reading reports with a look of deep concentration. She was in her late 50s, sharp as a tack, and respected by the whole county, including Frank. When he entered, she looked up and leaned back in her chair. "Frank Delaney," she said, voice calm but cautious. "I heard about Orson. I'm glad he's alive." "I need your help," Frank said without sitting down. "I think Cal Mercer's involved. Earl Whitman told me the rope matches the kind used at the freight yard. Cal's been working nights, disappearing during shifts. He acted nervous when I brought it up. And Orson, he looked like he'd been drugged." Pruitt listened carefully, then gestured for Frank to take a seat. "You're not wrong to be suspicious," she said. "But Frank, there's something you should know. We've had reports, minor theft, trespassing, some missing tools from the yard. Nothing big enough to act on. But you're not the first to bring Cal's name into it." She paused. "The thing is, Cal's alibi doesn't cover the day Orson went missing, but there's someone else who popped up on our radar recently. Frank's brow furrowed. Who? She pulled out a file and slid it across the desk. Landon Tilley. Lives on the edge of town with his mother, Martha. Used to work the yard before he was fired for aggression. Bit of a drifter since then. He's been spotted near the tracks multiple times over the past few weeks, including near your route. Frank stared at the name, Tilley. He hadn't thought of that family in years. Landon was trouble even as a teenager, always angry, always looking for someone to blame. And now, his path had somehow crossed with Orson's. The pieces weren't fitting yet, but a new door had opened. Frank stood up slowly, heart pounding again. Where can I find him? Sheriff Pruitt held his gaze. South side, off Pine Hollow Road. But be careful, Frank. He's not stable. And if he's involved, this isn't just about a dog anymore. Frank turned off the paved road and followed a narrow dirt track lined with frozen weeds and skeletal trees. The tires crunched over patches of old ice as he climbed the final bend to the Tilley property. A weathered cabin leaning slightly to one side, its porch sagging under years of neglect. A rusted pickup truck sat crooked in the driveway, hood popped, as if frozen mid-repair. The air was still, but it carried that heavy weight, like the world knew something bad had happened here and was holding its breath. He parked near the fence and got out slowly. The sound of his boots on gravel echoed unnaturally loud. No dogs barked. No wind moved the trees. He approached the porch, glancing toward a window partially covered with an old bedsheet. Just as he raised his hand to knock, the door creaked open. Landon Tilley stood there, barefoot on the wooden floor, wearing a stained thermal shirt and a look that was equal parts suspicion and weariness. His eyes were bloodshot, unstable. "Frank Delaney," he muttered, voice low and hoarse. "What the hell you want?" "I'm here about my dog," Frank said, steady but firm. "Orson. Someone tied him to the tracks. Left him to die. Sheriff says you've been spotted out there." Landon laughed. Not out of humor, but like a twitch. "You think I got time to chase mutts, old man? I haven't been near those tracks in weeks." "That's not what people are saying," Frank replied, watching him closely. "You worked the yards. You know the layout. You've got the rope. And I know about your temper." Something changed in Landon's face. His eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. "I didn't touch your damn dog," he said, stepping forward. "But maybe you should ask why someone would want to hurt you through him." His voice lowered. "People forget things in this town, Frank. But some folks remember too much." Frank blinked. "What are you talking about?" Landon smirked and leaned against the doorframe. "You think this is about a dog? It's not. It's about something you did. Or maybe something your wife knew. You don't even see it yet, do you?" He stepped back and began to close the door. "Check the past before you blame the present." The door slammed shut, leaving Frank standing alone on the porch, heart pounding, thoughts spinning. Landon hadn't denied involvement. Not really. But he'd pointed towards something else. Something buried. And for the first time, Frank wondered, was this about Orson at all? Frank didn't go home right away. Instead, he drove to the only place that still held pieces of Claire, the attic above their old garage. The house had been quiet for months, the way places get after grief settles into the walls. But now it felt heavier, like something had been waiting for him to return. He pulled down the attic ladder and climbed slowly, the air thick with dust and old memories. Boxes were stacked along the back wall, labeled in Claire's careful handwriting. Among them, one marked, "Private, 2003. He set the box down and opened it. Inside were old notebooks, letters, and a worn leather journal Claire had kept during the years she worked part-time at the town library. He flipped through the pages, unsure what he was even looking for, until he saw the name, Martha Tilley, and below it, scrawled in red pen, "Petition land deal, railroad cover-up." His hands trembled slightly as he read the entry. Claire had been involved in a small group that challenged a land acquisition by the rail company back in 2003. According to the notes, the company had rerouted part of the freight line through undeclared property, land that had belonged in part to Martha Tilley's late husband. The town had quietly settled the issue, paid off what it needed to, and erased the rest. Claire had taken it personally. She believed people were silenced, threatened, and she'd kept everything just in case. Frank sat back, breath shallow. Landon's words echoed now with terrifying clarity. Something your wife knew. Was this the reason? Could someone connected to that old cover-up be targeting Frank now, using Orson to send a warning? But who? The company? Someone from the board? Or maybe someone with a grudge like Landon? Downstairs, Orson lifted his head weakly from the blanket. Frank returned to him slowly, sitting beside him on the floor. The dog's eyes searched his, as if sensing that something had changed. She knew, Frank whispered. Claire knew something she wasn't supposed to, and now someone wants to bury it for good. He looked toward the garage window, the snow outside glowing faintly in the moonlight. The past wasn't resting. It had waited all these years, just beneath the surface. And now that Frank had pulled back the first layer, there was no turning back. Someone had tried to silence Claire once, and now they were coming for him through Orson. But they made one mistake. Orson survived. The morning was bitterly cold, but Frank didn't feel it. He drove to the Tilley residence with one goal in mind. Answers. Not from Landon, from Martha. She had been there in 2003. Her name was in Claire's journal. She had stayed quiet through it all. But Frank knew the kind of silence that hides something dangerous. The kind that poisons a town slowly over the years. He parked in front of the sagging porch once again and climbed the steps with heavy boots and heavier thoughts. Martha answered the door slowly, bundled in a long cardigan. Her gray hair pulled into a loose bun. She didn't look surprised to see him, just tired. "You found Claire's notes," she said softly, before Frank could speak. "Didn't think you'd dig that deep." "She wrote everything down," Frank said, his voice low. "About the land, the rerouted rail, the payoffs, and your husband." Martha stepped aside and motioned him in. The house smelled like wood smoke and old books. She moved carefully, her joints stiff with age. "Claire wanted to expose it all," she said. But she didn't realize how many people had something to lose. The railroad threatened lawsuits. Landon, he lost his job over it. Said she ruined us. Frank frowned. So he blamed her. "Still does," Martha admitted, settling into her chair. "But Landon didn't tie your dog to the tracks, Frank. He's broken, not evil. He talks big, but he wouldn't hurt Orson. Someone else used your past to get under your skin." Frank leaned forward. "Then who?" Martha hesitated. Then, with a shaky hand, she picked up an envelope from the table and slid it toward him. "A man came here 2 nights ago," she said. "Said it was time to finish what never should have started. He left this. Said if I warned you, I'd regret it." Inside the envelope was a single photograph, Orson tied to the tracks, and a note scribbled in harsh black ink. "Next time, it won't be the dog." Frank's blood turned ice cold. This wasn't just a warning. It was a threat, personal and precise. Someone powerful, someone still tied to the railroad, was sending a message. Claire had gotten close to the truth, and now, because of her, he was in their crosshairs too. He stood up, fists clenched. "No more silence," he said. Martha nodded slowly, eyes glistening. "Then finish what she started." Frank stood in the sheriff's office, the photograph clenched in one hand, Claire's journal in the other. Sheriff Geneva Pruitt read both in silence, her jaw tightening as she flipped through the pages. "This is enough," she finally said. "We've looked the other way for too long." She picked up the phone. "It's time to pay a visit to Martin Keeley." Martin Keeley, former rail company executive, now retired, but still pulling strings behind the scenes. He had signed off on the land rerouting deal in 2003, covered up the payouts, and quietly threatened those who tried to expose the truth. Claire had known it. Now Frank had proof. And Keeley had left a signature on that threat without even realizing it. The same black marker used in Claire's old library notes. The same sharp handwriting. A quiet tyrant finally exposed. They drove together to Keely's estate just outside town. He opened the door with forced politeness, but his eyes betrayed him. He knew. Geneva laid out the evidence calmly. Frank said nothing, just stared at the man who had tried to bury Claire's voice, then used Orson to finish the job. "You almost killed him," Frank said quietly, "but you failed. Again." Keely tried to deny it, of course, but the photo, the rope, the history, it all pointed to him. Geneva didn't hesitate. She read him his rights on the spot, her voice steady and unforgiving. As the cuffs clicked into place, Keely glanced at Frank one last time. "Your wife started this mess," he muttered. "Should have stayed in her place." Frank didn't blink. She was never in a place you could control. 2 days later, Frank returned home with Orson walking at his side, still limping, but stronger. They stood together in the backyard, where Claire used to plant wildflowers every spring. Frank knelt and opened a small wooden box. Inside were her ashes, and beside them, her journal, now closed for good. "We did it," he whispered. "They heard you. They finally listened." Orson laid his head on Frank's knee, eyes soft, tail thumping once against the grass. And in that stillness, under the gray sky, with the wind gently moving through the trees, Frank understood something deeper than grief. Some bonds don't end when someone leaves. Some loves echo long after the silence. And sometimes, justice doesn't come through vengeance, but through remembrance, courage, and a dog who refused to give up.